Good afternoon and welcome to our session on investing in African prosperity. Over the last 16 years, we have focused on different regions of the world. This year, more than ever before in any other conference, we have focused our attention on Africa. And today, we have a group of panelists to bring great insights into the opportunities and challenges in Africa and why we made the decision that we feel today is the time to focus on Africa. Starting on my right, I'd like to introduce Strive Masiwaya, who I will be referring to as Strive on this panel. Former Prime Minister Tony Blair, who will be Tony. Bill Gates. No, I got this one. His Excellency President Kagame, who has been with us for 3 or 4 days, and we've all had a chance to spend time together, and we appreciate that. And Rwanda Zogawi, and she, more than anyone on this panel, represents a company that has been in Chevron in Africa for more than 100 years, and we appreciate you joining us, Rhonda.
Thank you.
From that standpoint. To set the stage for this panel, why are we so focused on Africa? Why are we asking investors to focus on that? Why are we asking philanthropists, governments, companies, etc.? And I think, as we all know, prosperity is an answer to so many of the world's greatest challenges. And when we focus on prosperity in Africa, it brought me back to a formula that I had written down in 1965 at Berkeley, where essentially prosperity needed access to financial capital, which served as a multiplier effect on human capital, social capital, and real assets. And each of our panelists, in so many ways, has been addressing the issues of human capital, social capital, and building real assets in Africa. And prosperity is coming to Africa. But what exactly does that mean? Where are we going to start? Let's start with human capital. Africa's population today is around 1 billion, or about 15% of the world's population. It is projected to be at 25% by the year 2050. Africa is experiencing a youth bulge, greatly due to many of the achievements of the Gates Foundation and others, and its current median age is 20, compared to 45 in Japan, 37 in the United States, 35 in China, 35 worldwide. While fertility rates are dropping, or we could say leveling off, they're still high and among the highest in the world in sub-Saharan Africa. We hear a lot about education and health initiatives in Africa. Today on the panel, we have the leaders in that area. We can talk about urbanization in Africa. And in 1900, England was the only urbanized country in the world where more than 50% of the country lived in an urban environment. Today, much of the world is, and Africa would be the dominant area of the world in South Asia, that where 50% of the population is not urbanized. Financial capital, it's beginning to move in, but the financial markets, with less than $1 trillion in value, and in most countries, many countries, less than $1 billion in value in terms of financial equity markets. Investment inflows into Africa have increased, but they still are relatively low compared to the other parts of the world. And so when you look at growth rates, and you see that in the 10 years between 2000 and 2010, 6 of the 10 countries with the highest growth rates in the world were in Africa. And when you look at the projections of the IMF and see that 7 of the 10 highest projected growth rates in the world are in Africa, it's no surprise that we're focused on this area. We're very pleased to welcome His Excellency Paul Kagame, the President of the Republic of Rwanda. There is probably no better example of the potential for Africa than Rwanda. President Kagame, can you open today's discussions by briefly sharing your own story as a refugee from Uganda, as a leader of the RPF, the Rwandese Patriotic Front, and as president of your country?
Thank you, Michael, and fellow panelists. First of all, I want to appreciate the people here on the panel who are associated in many ways with African story, from Tony Blair, Bill Gates, and others who have helped supporting different efforts on the continent, and fellow African from Zimbabwe, the other side, who is part of the story, and Chevron, who are doing all of that. But mine is to show how the turnaround has been made from a hopeless state of my country. 19 years ago, losing 1 million people and starting from a very low base on everything and picking up the pieces and being able to rebuild the country. But as I say this kind of situation, much as it is to the extreme in the case of Rwanda, it mirrors many other stories on the continent where people have had to start from, and how the story has changed about Africa. What Africa was 10, 15, 20 years ago is not the same story about the continent. Many countries have made good progress in terms of prosperity and other aspects of life. But for Rwanda, we are informed in many ways by this tragic situation where from that very low base, low education levels, low health care, or non-existent in terms of the systems that were lacking in the country, and many other aspects of really a poverty-stricken situation and population that we have had to give hope and change the story from the partnerships that have been put together, whether it is government, companies, philanthropists, and mainly the citizens themselves, how when they have been mobilized and talked to and shown that once they are given basics, they can really do the rest in most cases. That's how Rwanda's story has come together, but there is that long history which Michael have mentioned, which probably I wouldn't go into the details of because it would be a long story. But what you have mentioned about, say, my own background from a refugee situation. I was a refugee in Uganda for 30 years, and later on we had to struggle to regain our citizenship to our own country. And there are many stories about different people having struggled through this kind of situation. But for what is important today is where Rwanda is and how we have come from that very hopeless state to one where our country has, for the last 10 years, registered growth of between 7 to 8%. And we have seen incomes and wages rise year in, year out. We have seen citizens coming, forward and feeling that they own the different processes and participating in those for the better of their lives. And I want to believe that since Rwanda can do this, and if Rwanda can do this, many other African countries can do it as well. And evidently, many other African countries are making very significant progress. And the ambition is to deal with, go beyond poverty, solve the problems of poverty, rise to middle income status, say by 2015. And we have seen that out of 54 countries on the continent of Africa, 25 have achieved that or are about to achieve that. So that shows how the story is increasing positive. And this is what I wanted to share with the different people here in the audience and with their backgrounds. Since there is this partnerships, there is this partnership that brings together government, the citizens of the country, the philanthropists, and the investors. I want them, and I would invite them to associate themselves with this kind of story. And it has many sides to it that are very positive. First of all, it is a win-win situation for any investment made in Africa, given what Africa provides today. There is good return on that investment. But more importantly, there is high impact made on the people of Africa in terms of improvement of their lives. So I think that coming together is extremely crucial. And I would just say the story of Africa is a good one, and they need to know it. And we are here to tell them the story of our continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Bill, you chose to go to Africa a number of years ago with your efforts. At the Global Conference and the Milken Institute, we've been very focused on the fact that more than 50% of all economic growth in the world can be traced to advances in the biosciences. You, more than anyone else, you and Melinda, took the leadership to focus on, can we increase the health and wellness, extend life, and improve the quality of life in Africa? What has your experience has been like? How would you relate it to our group today, Bill?
Well, we've had a great experience partnering with groups in Africa to raise health and improve agricultural productivity. And I'd say those are two of the 5 things that really put a country on a track to be self-sufficient. You've got health, agriculture, governance, education, and infrastructure. And it's a magic mix of those things that get you going. Rwanda is a great example where they've really invested in all of those things. The health statistics that I know the best have improved a lot there. But we're seeing that pretty broadly in Africa. There was a dearth of investment. The diseases of the countries in Africa weren't invested in because there was no market signal that said, hey, if you have a malaria vaccine, you're going to get some large market reward. And so there are a few of these things in terms of the bootstrap that it's necessary for some combination of aid and philanthropy to come in and fund that research to get those things going. And we've seen that as we've gotten vaccines out, they've gone from having 20% of all African children die under the age of 5. Now it's down to 10%. Now that's still 20 times the chance of a kid in a middle income or rich country, they're dying. And along with those deaths, one thing that's in some ways less visible is the fact that for every kid that dies, there's 3 that through malnutrition or cerebral malaria or various health things they experience in their first 5 years, they're not ever developing their brain so that they can fulfill their potential and either for themselves or their country, go get educated and contribute. And so as you do these health things, they have these positive effects. The death rates, the capabilities. Also, ironically, or surprisingly, you actually do reduce the population growth because people choose to have less kids if they're having their kids grow up in a healthy way. And that means that everything about feeding and educating can be done. So it's a very hopeful story. It's quite a range of where different African countries are on this unlocking their human potential and getting things right. But overwhelmingly, it's a story where a lot are leading the way, and the formula of how you invest in health through aid and philanthropically is very clear today, and probably more catalytic than anything, which is why it's the full-time thing that I spend time on and find it very rewarding.
Bill, could you maybe relate what were the greatest surprises in this effort? You know, if you think of the 2 or 3 from where you start, or things turn out the way you thought they would?
Well, I thought when I got involved that the really high impact stuff would already be taken, and that you'd have to go and take things that were lower impact, that some mix of government and philanthropy would come in and already have done them, both in terms of figuring out how to get innovations created, like a malaria vaccine or an AIDS vaccine, and then innovating in how you deliver them, how you reach all the kids, how you use digital technologies to track some of that and make sure it's there where it needs to be. The gap was pretty mind-blowing, which was positive in a sense. It meant there was this huge opportunity. For example, there was a vaccine being given to rich kids who had a 1 in 1,000 chance of dying of this diarrhea, and not being given where kids in poor countries literally had a 10% chance of dying. And so there you just, through volume commitments, through changes in the way it's manufactured to get the price down, and building up partnerships, you can get that vaccine, it was called rotavirus, out, and get it to all of Africa. Rwanda was one of the first to adopt it, but now it's in 60% of Africa. In 2 years, it'll be in 100%. And so there were some almost miraculously impactful things that were there and available. I hadn't expected that. And then you can go and see the progress. The first time you go, it's a little bit, wakes you up to remind you of the things you take for granted that not everybody can. But then once you're going on a regular basis, particularly to countries like Ethiopia, Rwanda, that you can see that even on a year-by-year basis, dramatic things are happening.
So to paraphrase a couple of things, Bill, one, the potential impact is even greater than you thought it would be from that standpoint. And we sometimes forget in the United States, these statistics that Bill has given, that in 1900, the 20% of children below the age of 5 dying, that was the situation in the United States in 1900, that 1 out of 5 died by their 5th birthday. And when Bill talked about diarrhea and issues, the 3 major causes of death in the United States in 1900 were tuberculosis, diarrhea, and pneumonia. And so, is there anything that surprised you that was better than you thought when you went?
Well, the capacity, once the right things get in place, are pretty amazing. Ghana is a good example where, even at a very low level of income, they decided to have a great medical system, get the vaccines out to virtually 100% of the kids. They do it, they get higher coverage rates than the United States gets. It's quite an achievement. So once those systems are put in place, they're adopted, they're executed extremely well. You see that with cell phone adoption, where the right incentives are put in place. There's a lot of places like Nigeria, South Africa, that have incredible educational capacity. That needs to be invested and grown on the continent as a whole, but there's quite a bit. All these countries, there's people who've left the country that are willing to go back and get involved in things there. The person who worked at the foundation from Ethiopia got so involved that they created a thing called the Agricultural Transformation Agency, put him in charge of it. And it's been able to get agricultural productivity up by 30% because of various policy changes, a lot of which were being willing to trust the market, getting the infrastructure in place, getting some more capital into it. And so they are, a country that's had to have famine relief many times. Now they'll be a very substantial exporter, and they'll have a certainty of the grains even in the tough part of the country. And so the agricultural story there is a miracle. And agriculture is one where both philanthropy and private investment are very, very complementary. The philanthropy is for the very poorest and for the seeds, creating new seeds. And that's a place where Africa is very dynamic, although the number of crops that you have to invest in is unusually large. That is, it's not just the big three. There are about 14 crops you've got to get the productivity up on.
We sometimes forget in the United States that in 1800, we really had almost 90% of our population in the United States working in agriculture. By 1800, we were down to 40, and one person fed three, and today it's between 1% and 2%, and each person working in agriculture. So I think, Bill, you've talked about increasing the productivity of agriculture can make a big difference. Rhonda, you represent a company and yourself that's been very active in Africa for a long time. Today, we have a number of people that had organizations around the world, also on the philanthropy side, but also on the for-profit side. What are the conditions that Chevron has looked for to make investments on the scale that you do in Africa? And also, in terms of your perspective, how does Africa look to Chevron today versus 10 or 20 years ago?
Thanks, Mike. It's just an honor to be on this panel with such distinguished leaders that have done so much for the continent. And I'm going to start with your second question first, if I may. And if we could pull up our slide to give you a little context of Chevron in Africa. Very important continent for us. We have been there over 100 years, as Mike has said. We operate in business interests in 16 countries. Right now, 17% of our production comes from Africa, and since 2007, 25 billion of our capital spend we directed into the continent, which features some of the largest construction projects on the continent. And I'm proud to say that over 80% of the Chevron employees that manage our assets there are highly talented Africans. So we have a huge talented workforce that support our business. We recognize there's many challenges still in Africa, but I would say we have never been more confident about the progress that's being made and the prospect for its future. And that's due to a lot of things. It's due to the leadership that's on this panel here, individuals who have been instrumental in promoting peace, stability, development, eradication of disease, and good governance. Mike mentioned the changing landscape of aid, trade, and investment as more private sector flows, and with it technology and knowledge reaches Africa, the prospect for real economic growth becomes more promising. And as a recent Economist article had mentioned that I read just a few weeks ago, that it's the African people themselves. I mean, we see their potential and their resilience. And they are seeking well-being and peace. They are embracing technology and looking for opportunities to better their lives. So from our generational perspective, I agree with President Kagame. He talked about the last 10 years. I mean, we've been there a generation, but the last 10 years, we have also felt this progress firsthand. And let me give you 3 examples. The first, with peace comes social progress. And we experienced in Angola that progress. A turning point, April 4th, 2002. A ceasefire declared the end of a 27-year civil war. 4 million Angolans were displaced, and the country's infrastructure in ruins. I think President Kagame can relate to their plight at that time. President dos Santos reached out to Chevron and invited us to help rebuild. And we took that offer on. And we joined with USAID, UNDP, and others to form a groundbreaking partnership to promote peace through economic development. We helped rebuild agriculture. We started the country's first microcredit bank that now boasts 15 branches. And now today in Angola, they are so much more a peaceful and prosperous nation that are no longer relying on emergency aid. So in the last 10 years, point 1, we've seen social progress firsthand. Point 2, our investments are driving industrial progress. Our energy investments can range from $5 to $10 billion. More and more over the last decade versus the previous one is finding its way into African companies. Simply put, if we are going to serve the world's demand for energy, we just can't invest in resource development. We have to invest in capacity building in the producing countries themselves. And with that, we are raising standards of manufacturing, business transparency, and rule of law. So with private capital flows comes all of the advantages of higher standards as well as job creation, skilling a workforce, and economic diversification. So industrialization, we're seeing a change in the last decade. The third, I'm going to give credit to Tony. I can call Mr. Blair Tony on this panel today, which is kind of cool. 11 years ago in Johannesburg, Prime Minister Blair at the time launched an initiative called EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, to drive good governance and standardization into transparency around extractive industry revenue. We've been the longest serving member of that EITI board for the last 10 or 11 years. And now we have 37 countries and over 70 companies signed on, and just under $1 trillion in government revenue from the extractives has been disclosed. This will start to empower citizens of producing countries, informing them about resource wealth distribution. So these are big signposts. So what we have learned, and getting to now to Mike's second question, if I was to take away one learning from our experience and share that with you, if 100 years has taught us anything, it's taught us that investment in Africa is a partnership with Africa. And although naturally we are drawn to the wealth that they possess below ground, our business success depends on the stability and the vitality of these nations above ground. And what do we look for when we want to invest in a country? Getting to Mike's first question, and I'm almost done. Of course, we want safety of operations. We want stable investment frameworks. We want rule of law. We want a capable supply chain. We want all of these things. But by supporting the aspirations of African nations for peace, stability, and prosperity for their people, we actually, in turn, enhance those necessary conditions for us in these countries. And today, from our point of view, geologically speaking, Africa is still an underexplored continent. But whether you're thinking above ground or below ground, the opportunity is actually immense. And so at this pivotal moment in where these nations are with respect to growth, our best advice to the private sector is support African nations on both fronts. It will be good for your business, it will be good for the people of Africa, and it's going to be really good for the global economy.
Thank you very much, Ron. So, Tony, obviously you've been very focused on education, but you've also been very focused on government. And how can African nations increase their human capital? If we start with the belief that Nobel Prize winner Gary Becker, that's been with us, pointed out, if human capital is really ultimately 75% of the real assets of a country. Bill has been very focused on the number one, how do you increase human capital? You increase the quality of life, you increase the length of life, and then you increase education. I know President Kagame has really invested heavily in health and education. I think 15% of your budget went to education from that standpoint. What about government, and how have you seen your role in Africa over the last decade?
Thanks, Mike. I am really optimistic about Africa. And it's a pleasure to talk about it, because usually where I go, people want to talk to me about either Europe or the Middle East. And so to lighten the mood, I then talk about Africa, whether they like it or not, really. I'm optimistic for many reasons, but let me just pick out one, which is the quality of the young leadership I see emerging now in Africa, in politics, in business, in civic society. And you're seeing it everywhere. And it kind of ties in with what we're trying to do. When I was Prime Minister of the UK, we at the Gleneagles Summit in 2005 for the G8, we agreed a large extra commitment of aid. And that aid has been immensely important, by the way. And particularly when it's been allied in partnership with people like the Gates Foundation, it really has achieved an immense amount. And one of the things, by the way, it's really important to understand is that there's been extraordinary progress in dealing with some of the main disease areas in these last years. And hundreds of thousands of lives have been saved as a result. I mean, hundreds of thousands. And this is where, you know, the contribution of Bill and others is absolutely immense. Having done that as Prime Minister, I learned something else in my interaction with African countries, which was, as this new generation of leaders came on, they also wanted to have a partnership with us in the developed world that was about them taking the destiny of their country into their own hands and moving from a situation where they were in a donor-recipient relationship with the developed world to a situation in which it was a partnership between the two. And for this to happen, I identified the quality of governance as absolutely central. In other words, these African countries could get so far, but without a strong improvement in the quality of government, they were always going to be inhibited. And you know, you see from what President Kagame has done in Rwanda, I mean, the quality of that government has made the difference in reducing poverty, creating jobs, reducing disease, giving people opportunity. Now, there was one other thing, though, that we then wanted to focus on, is that if it had to be a partnership, and if it was about the quality of government, what I wanted to focus on was there were lots of people talking quite rightly about the need for honesty and transparency in government. As Ro was saying, the extractive industries transparency initiative was one attempt to deal with that. But I wanted to focus on one of the things I'd actually learned as Prime Minister of a country for 10 years. You see, here's the thing about politics, which I found very curious. I thought when I came to power and I was Prime Minister and sat in Downing Street, that if I sat in the cabinet room and I took a decision, something happened. Yeah. And there was this shocking revelation to me after a time that it wasn't like that at all. And that actually a large part of the system was designed to make sure that nothing happened. Now, I ended up finding that the toughest thing about government was getting things done. So I didn't want just to focus on government, I wanted to focus on how you make government effective. How do you actually get programs delivered? And what we do now is we work with presidents, like President Kagame, we put a team of people on the ground, working alongside the president's team, in order to deliver their programs of change. And in simple, basic areas, like how do you get the lights on in your capital city? How do you make sure the necessary roads are built for agriculture to be able to prosper? If you've got a healthcare initiative, and maybe you've got the dollars to promote this initiative, but you just don't have the expertise to make the thing work, how do you help them do this? And it's very simple, it's very effective, and it's something we absolutely love doing. And the interesting thing about it is this, that we recruit the teams of people from the outside, and they will go and live and work in the country. And then I will interact with the president of the country and the ministers that we work with. And, you know, I thought at first it would be hard to get people to come. It's not. People love to be part of this excitement around the change in a country. And, you know, what I would like to do in the future is to take this even further and start in each of these types of areas, getting people who've, you know, not people who've written a paper about it, but people who've done it, and get leading companies in various areas, international companies, to say, look, maybe they've got someone in their early 30s, mid-30s, and how about coming and spending a year and actually helping a government deliver a program of change? I mean, there's a fantastic amount that can be done. And, you know, one of the other things I learned about government is that, you know, I sometimes used to think that I get twice as much done with half the number of people, but it's if you have a good, solid team of people around you, it's amazing how much can get done. So that's what we focus on and try to do. And you know, it's something that speaks absolutely to, I think, what I think is the great challenge in Africa now, which is to get these basic things around infrastructure, private sector investment, and the right rules there, how you make it clear that once the government's decided something, it actually gets it done.
Thank you, Tony. Strive, we have hundreds of CEOs and business leaders here, men and women from around the world. Many of them got sent to them by friends their $100 trillion Zimbabwe currency. And you're wondering, how can you do business in a country where you've gone from $1 to $100 trillion? Now, I personally, Strive, I want you to know, made a poor investment. When it got to $100 billion, I thought, boy, this could be a good investment at $100 billion. So I bought about $1,000 worth at $100 billion, only to discover in a short period of time it was $100 trillion. Now, you have been successful in numerous countries. You focused on an area that we have focused on myself over 30 years, and that was the mobile industry, allowing people to communicate. I think, talk about your experience as an entrepreneur, and we know you've been involved with social change and other things, but let's put your running a for-profit company hat on and let people have an understanding of what you've done, the businesses and the opportunities where you're running a for-profit company, and how did you build a for-profit company that still exists and you still own part of in Zimbabwe?
Well, thank you, Mike. Yes, I did get paid for service with that $1 trillion. And it wasn't enough. You know, first of all, let me thank you so much for bringing attention to Africa. For many of us, this is the part of the narrative of Africa we've always wanted you to hear. Not that we don't want you to hear other narratives, but it was time that you heard that Africa is open for business, and that many of us do normal business in Africa, even for $1 trillion. You know, when I went home to my...
That's $1 trillion Zimbabwe dollars, not US dollars.
When I returned to my homeland, Zimbabwe, as a young engineer in 1984, it had just come out of its war of independence. We'd had a civil war. I was a young engineer. I was very keen to get on with the development of the country. And I worked for the government. And after a while, I discovered, very much like Tony Blair here, even from a different level, that even from down there, if you wanted something done, nothing got done up there. So it was extremely difficult to work in a state enterprise. So I took the decision to go into business. And I've told people that I borrowed the equivalent of $75 US and went off and registered a company and started a construction business. So I built that over a few years. And something very interesting I observed one day, that in our culture, whenever one of your employees dies, you are required to attend the funeral. And I was beginning to attend a tremendous number of funerals. And that's when I saw the first storm that we faced, which was HIV/AIDS, was killing our workers. And many of them, there was no pension, there was no security. So we started a program for sending their children to school. And that program grew over a period of 20 years, whereby today, at any one time, we send about 48,000 children to school. And that's how we entered the philanthropic space and learned a little bit about what Bill does. Tremendous work that he does. We do some work with him in agriculture, which is very exciting. I hope we'll talk about that a little later. But you know, as an African entrepreneur, I knew very early that I came from a very small country, and that if we were to grow, I had to have a global perspective, and began to do something which many African entrepreneurs are only now beginning to do, which is to cross borders and go and build businesses in other countries. And it was at a time when, you know, if you arrived at a border and you said, I want to invest, the police picked you up and said, you know, why can't you do it in your own country? But Africa has changed. And as Tony was saying, you know, the quality of governance on the African continent, as I have observed it, working over a period of 20 years, is remarkable today, given where we started. When Mandela was coming out of prison, only 5 or 6 African countries held regular elections. Today, only 5 or 6 African countries don't hold regular elections, and believe you me, most of them are in the north. You know, the governance has improved. And of course, there is room for improvement all the time. You might even say that here. So, you know, give us some space. we are improving the governance. But we are seeing the result of it. You know, moving in African countries, setting up businesses, there are many, many challenges. And hyperinflation was just one of them. Yes, we faced 500 billion% inflation in Zimbabwe. And as a telecommunications business, we were not allowed to increase our prices without government approval. And the government did not recognize there was hyperinflation. So they didn't approve our tariffs for periods of 6 months at a time. And that remained throughout the crisis. So we provide a free service to our customers. And today in that country, we have 8 million customers. One of the great things about the Zimbabwean economy, of course, is it got rid of the Zimbabwe dollar and trades in US dollars. So we don't, one of the challenges we have with a lot of the markets we operate in is actually exchange losses. So one thing you don't get is exchange losses in Zimbabwe. But we've built businesses in some 17 African countries, different kinds of businesses, including telecommunications. And really, my counsel to you as entrepreneurs is going to Africa is not exotic. Don't look at it as an exotic thing. It's normal in every single sense. The same sort of decision processes that you need to make in setting up a business anywhere. We have a business in New Zealand today, Bolivia. We'd make the same kinds of decisions. First of all, you've got to know the place where you're going. We're talking Africa, but Africa isn't a country. It's a continent. And I know it surprises people sometimes when I say that. There are 54 sovereign countries. And they're as varied in as anything you can imagine. You know, so, you know, somebody, I was making a presentation in Holland the other day, and one of the businessmen got up and said to me, you know, I wanted to do something in South Africa, but I've been looking at Kenya, and I've been looking at the statistics. I don't think I can go to South Africa. I said, well, did you know South Africa built a nuclear bomb and dismantled it? And we haven't told the Iranians yet. You know, so it's as varied as that. you have very sophisticated, very complex countries. You have countries at different levels of development, different language systems, different types of governance. But if you approach it with the same way you would approach any other market you are going to enter into, looking at issues of human capital, the rule of law, very important. It's not the rule of the president, but the rule of law is as important in setting and establishing your business in those countries as in any other jurisdiction you might go into. So really, Michael, Africa is very normal. The challenges that you will face in establishing businesses are exactly the same as you will face in Latin America, Asia, and the only difference is that there are local issues to take into account. But if you ask me today, where would I like to invest, Nigeria or Russia? I'm for Nigeria. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. President Kagame, I know you're a student of history. I know you've studied different countries around the world, and obviously the history of Europe is one of wars for 1,000 years, conflicts, etc. How have you taken the lesson of history in your leadership in Rwanda and the leadership in Africa today?
Well, our history is such that it has taught us many lessons. And in a way that has not only informed us, but also put pressure on us to deliver. And as was said earlier on, even though you may have intention to deliver and you understand what needs to be done, there are real issues now of how you go about it, and that requires capacity. So if capacity is lacking, then you have to build it, and in our case, we have approached it by saying, first of all, among the lessons we have learned, when tragedies strike like it happened in our own country, at some point you find you are on your own. So you really got to face it. First of all, you got to understand that this is your problem. You got to face it up front. If you are going to have people who support you in overcoming the challenges, you have to go to be there doing your best, and then the support will come. If you are not doing that, if the support comes at all, it won't make much difference because